Assalamu alaikum, welcome back to the story of sunshine and iron as part of the series Science and Quran. So we have come close now to the end of our intellectual journey, where humanity finally solved the puzzle, what makes the sun shine? The fusion of hydrogen into helium, and that the changes that occur inside these atomic nuclei give off energy by the equation E equals mc squared. I just want to show you an illustration of what scientists now firmly believe goes on inside the sun, what is known as the proton-proton chain reaction sequence, where we start off with 4 hydrogens and we end up with a helium which has 2 protons and 2 neutrons. I won't go through the details of the reaction, but energy is given off along the way, and if we add up the mass before and the mass after, we find that the helium is slightly less in mass than the 4 hydrogen protons, and that difference in mass using E equals mc squared is what gives off the energy. Here's a very similar calculation, adding tritium to deuterium to produce helium-4 and a neutron. Notice we have 1 proton, that's what makes hydrogen, with 3 nucleons, that means we have 1 proton and 2 neutrons, that's tritium, 1 proton and 1 neutron to give a total number of 2 nucleons, that is deuterium, gives us helium and a neutron. 0 protons and 1 neutron, of course, in the neutron. And notice that the number of total nucleons is 3 plus 2, which is 5, and here it is 4 plus 1, which is 5. Total number of protons is 1 plus 1, which is 2, and again, that's the same as 2 plus 0. So we end up with the same number of protons and neutrons, but when we actually add up the masses, we find that there are different binding energies, and that gives the molecules different mass. And if we were to add up the masses of tritium and deuterium, this is now in kilograms, this is the total mass of the reactants before. Here's the total mass of a helium-4 and a neutron. We notice that there is a slight difference, 0.030 times 10 to the minus 27th kilograms for each single reaction, where we have lost this much mass, and we just take that mass and plug it into E equals mc squared, and we get this much energy, 0.27 times 10 to the minus 11th joules. And when this happens innumerable times in the sun, that energy released is what makes the sun shine. So that is the end of an amazing intellectual journey. We have left off some subtleties that we will touch on, inshallah, in later lectures. But I hope now that when we encounter the verse, وَجَعَلْنَا سِرَاجًا وَهَّاجًا, we have placed therein a lamp full of blazing splendor, we now appreciate the majesty of this verse. And we do that by appreciating how long of an intellectual journey and how arduous of a trek it was for humanity to understand something of what it is that makes this lamp full of blazing splendor. And we haven't hit by far the whole story. We've left off some of the most amazing details that inshallah we will touch on as we go deeper in later lectures, later in this series, about the constants of nature. For example, we haven't talked about the problem of taking protons, which are all positively charged, and squeezing them together into a helium nucleus because positive charges repel each other. How does that happen? Well, there's a balance between Coulomb forces that cause electrical repulsion and something called the strong nuclear force that attracts nucleons together. And at first, when the calculations were done, it was felt that you couldn't overcome the electrical repulsion. Then a phenomenon known as quantum tunneling was discovered, and it was understood how this happens. So my point here is that the subtlety and the intricacy and the majesty of the physical laws that allows the sun to shine and to do so constantly and for century after century. In fact, millennium after millennium, million after million, billion after billion of years, that is really something that should not be taken for granted, as I spent so much of my life just taking the sun for granted. Now, let us touch on some of the other amazing verses in the Quran: the sun versus the moon, radiant lamp versus reflected light. When Galileo turned his telescope on the moon, he again realized that the sun and the moon were not made of ether. They were imperfect material bodies. And at some point between Aristotle and Galileo, humanity realized, and we don't know that point exactly, that while initially it may seem that the sun and the moon are the exact same thing, just a difference in quantity. The sun is made of ether and burns very bright. The moon is made of ether but burns less bright. At some point, humanity realized there's a qualitative difference. The sun shines on its own, but the moon shines only by the reflected light of the sun. This was another major intellectual milestone for humanity. And here in Surah Nuh, look at what the Quran is saying. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وجعل القمر فيهن نورا وجعل الشمس سراجا. And he set up within them the moon, within the skies, as the moon as a light reflected, and set up the sun as a radiant lamp. So the Quran uses the word siraj to indicate a fire that burns on its own, and the moon as simply a light. And that doesn't mean it has its own intrinsic light. And the Quran draws this beautiful difference between the sun as a radiant lamp and the moon as reflected light. And let's look at this verse from Surah Yunus. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم هو الذي جعل الشمس ضياء والقمر نورا. So again, here the Quran is saying He is the one who made the sun ضياء, a source of radiant light, وَالْقَمَرَ نُورًا, and the moon a light, and Muhammad Asad here in his translation puts reflected, because again there's an intrinsic difference between ضياء and nur. And here is the commentary of Muhammad Asad that I would like to read to you. The nouns ضياء and nur are often interchangeable inasmuch as both denote light. But many philologists are of the opinion that the term ضياء or ضوء has a more intensive connotation and is used to describe a light which subsists by itself as that of the sun and fire, that is, a source of light, while nur signifies a light that subsists by some other thing. And this is by the philologist Lane, on the authority of the very famous compendium of Arabic linguistics, Tajul Arus. So in other words, light due to an extraneous source, or as in the case of the moon, reflected light. And that is why the Quran, in these two places, talks about the sun and the moon differently, indicating this amazing subtlety that Ash-Shams is diya, it is an intrinsic source of light, while the moon is nur, just a light, something that shines, but a reflected light. And look at how the rest of the verse goes. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala links this phenomena that the moon is a source of reflected light to the phases of the moon. That is why we have a crescent moon, a full moon. It depends on where the moon is in relation to the earth regarding the sunshine. So we see that when the moon is in one station, the light is only partially reflected and we have a crescent moon. So we see that when the moon is directly opposite the earth, when it is sort of between the earth and the sun, it is completely dark, and as it shifts away we get a little sliver, and then it grows to a half moon when these form a 90-degree angle. Then when the moon is behind the earth and the sunlight lights its entire face, we get the full moon, and so the cycle continues. And so look at what the Quran is saying. هو الذي جعل الشمس ضياء والقمر نورا وقدره منازل لتعلموا عدد السنين والحساب ما خلق الله ذلك إلا بالحق يفصل الآيات لقوم يعلمون. He it is who made the sun a source of radiant light and the moon a light reflected, and has determined for it its phases, so that you might know how to compute the years and measure time. None of this has God created without an inner truth. Clearly does He spell out these messages onto people of innate knowledge. So when the Quran is using this sort of language, it is incumbent upon us to think deeply about these phenomena. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that this has been created with an inner truth. And hopefully, inshallah, some of this knowledge at least touches a part of that immense and beautiful and majestic and subtle inner truth. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that He clearly in this way spells out His signs لِقَوْمٍ يَعْلَمُونَ, for those who know. And that makes it our job to know. We have one last episode in this series that I think inshallah you will also find very intriguing. And I hope you will join us for that, because we still haven't finished our title, The Story of Sunshine and Iron. We've just finished the story of sunshine. See you inshallah next time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.